What if the Bible isn't 66 separate books at all, but a single promise hidden in plain sight, repeated for thousands of years? One man found the thread by accident, buried in a box of his dead grandfather's notes. And what he uncovered shook everything he thought he believed. Daniel Carter had not planned to open that box. He had come to the old church archive in rural Tennessee to clear it out, nothing more. His grandfather had passed 8 months earlier, and the family had finally asked Daniel to sort through what the old pastor left behind. Boxes of hymnals, yellowed bulletins, a coffee mug with a crack running down the handle. He was 38, a Bible researcher by trade, and if he was honest with himself, he had stopped believing the Bible held any surprises. He'd read it front to back more times than he could count. To him, it was a library Genesis over here, the Gospels over there, 1,000 disconnected stories from 1,000 disconnected years. "Just get it done," he muttered to himself, kneeling on the dusty floor. In and out. Then he found the notebook. It was tucked beneath a stack of sermon papers, its leather cover soft and worn from decades of handling. Daniel almost set it aside with the rest, but something made him stop. His grandfather's handwriting covered every page, tight, careful, urgent. And on the very first line, underlined twice, was a single word: covenant. Daniel frowned. "Okay, Grandpa, what were you chasing?" He flipped the page. The next entry read, "They think these are different stories. They are not. It is one story. I have seen it now." Daniel felt the back of his neck prickle. He knew that tone. It was the tone of a man who had discovered something and couldn't sleep until he'd written it down. He turned the page again, and what he saw made him sit down hard on the cold floor. His grandfather had drawn a line, an actual line in fading blue ink, connecting names across the pages. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. And at the very end of that line, one word circled so many times the paper had nearly torn through: Jesus. "That's not possible," Daniel whispered. "You can't connect all of them. They're centuries apart, different authors, different languages, different—" But even as he said it, a memory surfaced. Something he'd noticed years ago in seminary and dismissed. That strange repeating word. That promise language showing up in the garden, showing up after the flood, showing up under the stars, with an old childless man, showing up on a mountain, showing up on a throne. He had always treated it as coincidence. Ancient people liked making deals with their gods, nothing more. His grandfather had written something else at the bottom of the page. Daniel read it out loud, and his voice caught. "Every time a man breaks the promise, God does not walk away. God comes back with a bigger one." Daniel closed the notebook. His hands were shaking, and he didn't fully understand why. He had spent his entire career treating the Bible like a puzzle box with the pieces scattered. But what if the pieces weren't scattered at all? What if they had always been part of one picture, and he'd simply never stepped back far enough to see it? "No," he said aloud, standing up, pacing. If that were true, someone would have noticed. Scholars would have noticed. I would have noticed. But that was the thing that unsettled him most. He had noticed. Everyone who read carefully noticed. They just never followed the thread all the way to the end. Daniel opened the notebook again, more slowly this time, the way a man opens a door he isn't sure he wants to walk through. His grandfather's final note on that page was a question, not an answer, and it landed on Daniel like a hand on the shoulder. If humanity keeps breaking the promise, why does God keep making a new one? What is he building toward? Daniel sat back down. He didn't clear out the archive that day, or the next, because he had realized something. He had spent his whole life believing the Bible was about people. Adam's failure, Noah's Ark, Abraham's journey, Moses' law, David's kingdom, and finally, the man from Nazareth. Separate heroes, separate lessons. But his grandfather was pointing at something underneath the people. A pattern that never broke no matter how many times they did. Humanity falls. God responds with mercy. A new promise begins. Over and over. garden to flood, flood to Abraham, Abraham to Sinai, Sinai to David's throne. And then that final upstairs room in Jerusalem, a cup of wine lifted, and words that suddenly terrifyingly seemed to gather every promise that had come before into one. You were trying to prove it, Daniel said quietly, staring at his grandfather's handwriting. You spent your whole life trying to prove that it's all one story. And in that dusty room alone, Daniel Carter made a decision that would consume the next several years of his life. He was going to finish what his grandfather started. He was going to trace the thread himself, every covenant from the first breath in the garden to the Last Supper in Jerusalem, and find out where it was leading. Because if the old pastor was right, then the Bible wasn't a library of broken pieces at all. It was a single, unbroken promise kept alive across thousands of years by a God who refused to give up on the people who kept giving up on him. And the pattern behind it, the pattern his grandfather died chasing, was about to reveal itself, one covenant at a time. Daniel picked up the notebook, held it against his chest, and turned toward the first name on that fading blue line. A garden, a choice, and a promise made in humanity's darkest hour. That was where the thread began. That was where he would begin too. The first name on the line was Adam, and Daniel almost skipped it. He'd taught the Garden of Eden 100 times. Snake fruit fall, he could recite it in his sleep. But his grandfather had circled it too, and beside it written 3 words that stopped Daniel cold. Read the promise. What promise? Daniel said to the empty room. There's no promise in Eden. There's a punishment. He pulled his worn Bible off the shelf and opened to Genesis, expecting nothing. Adam and Eve had been handed everything, a perfect world, meaningful work, a friendship with God, without a shred of fear in it. And they'd been given exactly one line they weren't supposed to cross. 1. Trust God's word or reach for their own way. They reached. Daniel had always stopped reading right there at the failure. Everyone did. But this time he kept going because his grandfather had underlined something further down a single sentence God spoke in the middle of the wreckage. And Daniel read it, and then he read it again, and then he set the Bible down very slowly. That's not a curse, he murmured. That's a rescue. Because before God ever named a consequence, before the exit from the garden, before any of it, he made a promise. A promise that something born of humanity would one day crush the very thing that had ruined them. In the darkest moment humanity had ever known, God's first words weren't, "You're finished." They were, "This isn't over." Daniel sat back, stunned. You reach for the fruit, you break the whole thing, and God's opening move is to promise you a way back. He grabbed his grandfather's notebook, flipping fast, now hunting for the pattern. And there it was, written in that urgent hand, humanity falls. God does not destroy. God promises. Okay, Daniel said, his pulse picking up. Once is a story. Show me it happens again. He didn't have to look far. The pages turned dark. Generations passed, and the world God had made turned rotten from the inside. Violence everywhere, corruption in everything, until the whole earth was choking on it. Daniel felt the weight of it as he read the sense of a creation collapsing under its own cruelty. And into that ruin walked one man named Noah. Daniel knew this story too. Ark animals, flood, children's wallpaper. But he was reading differently now, hunting the thread, and he found it exactly where his grandfather said it would be. After the waters. After the judgment. In the wreckage of a drowned world, God did the same thing he'd done in the garden. He made a promise. Never again. Daniel read aloud, and something in his chest tightened. God bound himself never to destroy the earth by flood again, and hung a rainbow in the sky as the sign of it. Not a warning. A guarantee. Daniel stood up and started pacing, talking to no one the way his grandfather must have. So it's the same move. Humanity falls apart. God brings judgment, and then right when you'd expect him to walk away, he reaches back. Every single time he reaches back. He stopped mid-step. That's what you saw, he whispered. That's the whole thing, isn't it? People break the promise, and God keeps making a bigger one. For a moment, he felt almost triumphant. And then a colder thought crept in, and it stole the wind right out of him. If God kept having to make new promises, that meant the old ones kept failing. Not on God's side, on theirs, on humanity's. The pattern wasn't just about mercy. It was about a wound that never healed. People kept doing the same thing over and over, no matter how many chances they were handed. And Daniel, who had spent his career studying these people from a safe distance, suddenly felt the pattern press uncomfortably close to home. "We never learn," he said quietly. "That's the part nobody says out loud." He wanted to keep going, and he did, but he wasn't the only one chasing this thread anymore. Because as Daniel dug deeper into Abraham's story that week, he came across the work of a historian named Michael Anderson, a modern researcher who had spent years obsessed with the same covenant. Daniel found his lectures late one night and couldn't stop listening because Anderson was asking the exact question rattling around in Daniel's own head. "Here's what breaks my brain about Abraham," Anderson said, in one recording his voice electric. "God walks up to an old man, no children, no heir. His body's as good as dead and his wife's past childbearing. And God says you're going to have descendants like the stars, more than you can count, a whole future you'll never live to see." Daniel leaned toward the screen. "Now think about that," Anderson pressed. "Every reasonable bone in Abraham's body should have said this is impossible. And you know what the text says he did. He believed it. Not because he had evidence, because he trusted the one making the promise." Daniel felt the floor shift under him again. "It's not about ability," he breathed. "That's the twist. It was never about what Abraham could do." He pulled up Anderson's contact information without even thinking, then hesitated, hand hovering. What would he even say? "Hi! I found my dead grandfather's notebook, and I think the whole Bible is one story." He'd sound like a crackpot. He wrote the email anyway, but before he sent it, he went back to the notebook one more time because something was nagging at him. His grandfather had written a note beside Abraham's name that he hadn't understood on the first pass. Now, with Anderson's voice still ringing in his ears, he read it again. "Abraham could not earn it. Neither can you. That is the whole point, and it is the thing that will save you." Daniel's throat went tight. He thought about Adam, who couldn't undo what he'd done. About Noah, who couldn't wash the world clean by himself. About Abraham, who couldn't manufacture a single child on his own, let alone a nation. 3 men, 3 impossibilities, and every single time the promise didn't rest on the man. It rested on God. "So the covenant survives because it doesn't depend on us," Daniel said slowly. "If it depended on us, it would have died in the garden." He hit send on the email to Anderson. Then he sat in the quiet, staring at his grandfather's handwriting, feeling the size of what he was walking into. Because now he could see 3 points on the line, and they all pointed the same direction. Fall, mercy, promise. Fall, mercy, promise. Fall, mercy, promise. A rhythm as old as the world itself, beating underneath every story he'd ever dismissed as separate. But 3 points don't make a destination. They make a direction. And Daniel could feel the line pulling forward past Abraham toward something bigger. A whole nation this time, rescued out of slavery, and dragged to the foot of a mountain to meet the God who'd been keeping promises since the garden. His phone buzzed. An email. Anderson had written back already, and it was one line. "You found it too, didn't you? Then you already know. The pattern gets worse before it gets better. Wait until you see what happens at the mountain." Daniel read it 3 times. Then he turned the page to Moses and to the covenant that would expose the one problem none of the others had dared to name. Wait until you see what happens at the mountain. Daniel couldn't get Anderson's line out of his head, so he went to the mountain. He read the story of a whole nation pulled out of slavery in Egypt, beaten, broken, hopeless people who'd been groaning under the whip for 400 years. And God heard them. God remembered the promise he'd made to Abraham centuries earlier, and he came down and ripped an entire people out of bondage with his own hand. "There it is again," Daniel said, tracing the line in his grandfather's notebook. "They didn't rescue themselves. He did it, same as always. He brought them to a mountain called Sinai, And for the first time in the whole story, God didn't make a promise to one man. He made it to an entire nation. He gave them laws, he gave them responsibility, and he gave them a mission that took Daniel's breath away when he really let it land. They were supposed to become a light, a whole people who would show the rest of the world what God was actually like. Daniel sat back. "That's beautiful," he said. "That's the most hopeful moment in the whole thing so far. A nation of former slaves and God hands them a purpose." And that was exactly why what came next hit him so hard. He kept reading. And the people who'd just watched God split a sea for them. The people who'd been fed by his hand in the wilderness. The people standing at the base of the very mountain where God was speaking. Those people turned around and built themselves a golden idol before Moses even made it back down. Daniel actually said it out loud. "You've got to be kidding me." He read it again to make sure. The ink was still wet on the covenant. The words had barely stopped echoing, and they were already breaking it. "How?" Daniel said, and there was something raw in his voice now. "How do you see all of that and still walk away?" He called Anderson that night. He couldn't help it. "You warned me," Daniel said the second the historian picked up. "You said it gets worse before it gets better, but I didn't expect it to get worse this fast. They break it immediately." "I know," Anderson said quietly. "That's the part that used to keep me up at night. Everybody wants to blame the golden calf. But Daniel, it's not about the calf." "What do you mean?" "Keep reading," Anderson said. "It's not one failure, it's a pattern. Watch what happens over the next few hundred years." So Daniel kept reading, and Anderson was right, and it was devastating. Because it wasn't just that one moment at the mountain, it happened over and over, generation after generation. God gave them the law, and they had it. They had it written on stone, carved and permanent, sitting right in front of them. They knew exactly what was right, and they still couldn't do it. Daniel stopped, set the book down, and a thought hit him so hard he had to stand up. "That's the twist," he whispered. "That's the whole thing. The problem was never that they didn't know." He grabbed his phone. "Anderson, I think I see it. The Mosaic Covenant, it's not the answer. It was never supposed to be the answer. It's a diagnosis." There was a pause on the line. Then Anderson said very softly, "Say that again." "It's a diagnosis," Daniel repeated, pacing now, the words tumbling out. "Every other failure you could explain it away. Adam didn't have the rules yet. Noah's world was corrupt from the start. But at Sinai, God gives them the rules, perfect rules. Carved in stone, no excuses, no confusion. And they still fail. So it can't be an information problem anymore. It's deeper than that." "Go on," Anderson said, and Daniel could hear him leaning in. "The law was like a mirror," Daniel said. "It didn't make them good. It just showed them in high definition that they couldn't be not on their own. The problem was never their knowledge. The problem was their heart." The line went quiet for a long moment. "That took me 15 years to figure out," Anderson finally said. "You got there in a week." Daniel didn't feel proud. He felt shaken. Because if the human problem was the heart, if it was something broken on the inside that no rule could reach, then every covenant so far had been circling the same wound without healing it. And he wondered with a chill whether any covenant could. "So where does it go from here?" Daniel asked. "If the law can't fix the heart, then what's left?" "There's one more you haven't traced," Anderson said. "David." Daniel turned the page, and the story shifted from a mountain to a throne. God took a shepherd boy, the youngest and least likely of his whole family, and made him a king. And then God made David a promise unlike any of the others. A promise that from David's own family line would come a king whose kingdom would never, ever end. Daniel felt the line in the notebook pulling tight now, humming with tension. "An eternal kingdom," he said. "That's not a small promise. That's the biggest one yet." But he already knew, because he'd learned the pattern, that a promise this big meant a failure this big was coming. And it came. The kings failed. Not one or two of them, nearly all of them. David's own son, his grandson. Down the line, generation after generation, kings who worshipped idols, who oppressed their own people, who threw away everything. Kingdoms split, enemies invaded, and finally, the unthinkable Jerusalem itself, the city of God's king, burned to the ground. The people dragged off into exile, scattered across the earth. Daniel read the account of the city falling and felt something like grief. "It's gone," he said. "The whole thing. The kingdom, the throne, the promise of an eternal king, it just collapses." For hundreds of years it looks like the promise died. He sat there in the quiet, the notebook open in his lap, and for the first time since he'd found it, he felt the pattern might actually break. Every promise before had been followed by a bigger one. But this time, the silence stretched on and on. No king, no throne, no word. Just an exiled people wondering if God had finally at last walked away for good. "This is where it ends, isn't it?" Daniel said, and it wasn't quite a question. The heart's still broken. The law couldn't fix it. And now even the king is gone. But his grandfather had written something at the bottom of the David page, and Daniel had almost missed it. He read it now, and his hands went still. The prophets were still speaking in the dark. They saw a king coming who would not fail. Look for him. Daniel's breath caught, because it was true. Even in the exile, even in the ruins, there were voices the prophets pointing forward. Not backward at what was lost, but forward at something that hadn't come yet. A ruler who wouldn't break the covenant like all the others. A kingdom that couldn't collapse. And more than that, a whisper of something the world had never seen. A new kind of promise entirely, one that wouldn't just hand people another set of rules to fail, but would reach all the way down into the human heart and do the one thing the law of Moses never could: change it. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. Every thread, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses. David was pulling toward a single point on the horizon he couldn't quite see yet, and then his phone lit up. "Anderson, one final message. You've traced every covenant in the Old Testament. Every one of them left something unfinished. Now count how many of those loose threads all get tied off in a single room, in a single night, over a single cup of wine. Count how many of those loose threads all get tied off in a single room, in a single night, over a single cup of wine." Daniel read that message and felt his heart start to pound. A single room. A single night. He knew exactly which one Anderson meant. He'd read it 100 times without ever seeing it. But he'd never read it this way, as the end of a thread that started in the garden. He opened his Bible to that final meal Jesus shared with his disciples in the city of Jerusalem the night before everything fell apart. And this time, Daniel read it holding his grandfather's notebook open right beside it, every covenant on that fading blue line laid out in a row. Jesus took bread. He took a cup of wine. And he said words Daniel had heard since childhood, words so familiar he'd stopped hearing them at all. "This is the new covenant." Daniel froze. "New covenant," he whispered. He said covenant. He looked down at the notebook at his grandfather's word underlined twice on the very first page. It's the same word. It's been the same word this whole time. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands. "Anderson." He names it. In that room, he doesn't say new teaching or new religion. He says covenant. He's using the exact same language as Sinai, as Abraham, as Noah. He knew. He knew he was standing at the end of the line. "Keep going," Anderson said. "Don't stop there. Line them up. Every covenant you traced. Watch what happens." So Daniel did, and what he found in the next 10 minutes reorganized everything he'd believed about the Bible. "Adam," he started, and his voice was unsteady. "The covenant with Adam that showed us the problem. Humanity's broken. We reach for our own way, and it ruins everything. That's the wound." "Right," Anderson said quietly. "Noah showed us God's mercy that even after judgment, he won't wipe us out. He keeps us alive so the story can continue." Daniel's finger moved down the line. "Abraham. Abraham showed us the promise that God would bless not just one family, but all nations through him, every nation on earth. Keep going. Moses. Daniel swallowed. Moses showed us what we couldn't do. The law was the mirror. It proved the problem was the heart, and that no rule could fix it. And David. His voice caught. David showed us the king, the one whose kingdom would never end. He stopped. The whole line was laid out in front of him now. The problem, the mercy, the promise, the diagnosis, the coming king. 5 loose threads, each one unfinished, each one leaving a question the covenant couldn't answer on its own. And then it hit him all at once, and Daniel had to put the phone down for a second because his eyes were stinging. "Anderson," he said, picking it back up. "He's not starting a new story." "No," Anderson said. "He's not. He's finishing the old one." Daniel was on his feet now. Every single thread, he ties them all off in that room. The broken heart Moses exposed. The new covenant reaches inside and changes it. The King David was promised, it's him. The blessing to all nations promised to Abraham. It happens through him. The mercy God showed Noah. It's poured out completely right there in the bread and the wine. His voice broke on the last words. "It was never a library, Anderson. My grandfather was right. It was always one story, and it was all pointing here." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Daniel remembered something that made him sit back down slowly. Something that had haunted the whole Old Testament. Something he'd read past 1,000 times. The sacrifices, the lambs, the offerings on the altar year after year, blood spilled over and over that never quite seemed to finish the job. "Anderson," he said slowly, "the sacrifices, all of them. The lambs, the offerings, they never actually solved anything, did they? They just kept pointing, like they were waiting for something." "For someone," Anderson corrected gently, and there it was. The final twist, the one Daniel hadn't seen coming, even though it had been in front of him his entire life. Every lamb ever laid on an altar, every drop of blood in the entire Old Testament, had been an arrow pointing forward toward one sacrifice that could actually do what all the others couldn't. Toward a king who would lay himself down. The animals had been standing in century after century for the one who would finally take the human problem all the way to its root and deal with it for good. Daniel remembered the question his grandfather had written that first day, the one that had pulled him into all of this. If humanity keeps breaking the promise, why does God keep making a new one? What is he building toward? Now he had the answer. And it undid him. "He was building toward this," Daniel whispered. Every broken promise, every failure, God kept coming back with a bigger promise because he was moving toward the one promise that couldn't be broken. Not because we finally got good enough. We never got good enough. That was the whole point. He did it for us because we never could. He thought about the pattern he'd traced through the entire story. Humanity falls. God responds with mercy. A new promise begins. He'd found it in the garden after the flood under the stars at the mountain on the throne. And now he saw where the pattern had been leading the entire time. The new covenant wasn't just the next one in the sequence. It was the destination the whole sequence had been reaching for. "It's not based on us being perfect," Daniel said, and now he was almost laughing through the tears, the relief of it hitting him. That's what I couldn't figure out. Every other covenant part of it rested on us, and part of us always failed. But this one doesn't rest on us at all. It rests entirely on him, on forgiveness, on grace. That's why it can't break. Because we're not the ones holding it up. Anderson was quiet on the other end, then softly. "Your grandfather spent his whole life trying to prove it was one story. You want to know something?" "What?" "He was wrong about one thing," Anderson said. "He thought he was proving it. He wasn't. He was just the first one in your family to see it. It was always one story, Daniel. Long before either of you noticed. The thread was always there." Daniel looked down at the notebook in his lap, at the fading blue line connecting Adam to Noah, to Abraham, to Moses, to David, and finally circled so many times the paper had nearly torn through that one name at the end. Jesus, the name that gathered every promise before it into one. And Daniel understood at last That the Bible he'd spent his whole career treating as scattered pieces had never been scattered at all. Every chapter was connected. Every promise was leading somewhere. Every covenant was pointing at the same destination, a restored relationship between God and the people who kept giving up on him, held together not by human perfection, but by a love that simply refused to quit. He closed the notebook. His grandfather's work was finished. But Daniel realized, sitting there in the quiet, that his own was only beginning, because a discovery like this was never meant to stay in a dusty archive. It was meant to be carried out into the light and handed to the people who needed to hear it most. It was meant to be carried out into the light. And years later, that's exactly what Daniel did. He stood in front of a community gathering in America. His grandfather's notebook resting on the podium in front of him, its leather cover softer now from his own hands turning the pages 1,000 times over. The room was full. People who'd carried Bibles their whole lives. People who'd never opened one. And Daniel looked out at them and felt the weight of what he was about to say. "I want to tell you about a box I almost didn't open," he began. He told them everything. The archive in Tennessee. The notebook buried under sermon papers. The single word underlined twice. The fading blue line connecting names across thousands of years. And as he talked, he watched something happen in the faces in front of him. The same thing that had happened in him on that dusty floor. "For most of my life," Daniel said, "I thought the Bible was a collection of unrelated stories. Different people, different centuries. A library, not a story." He paused. "I was wrong. And I want to tell you what it actually is." He took a breath. "It's the story of a God who never once walked away." A woman in the third row wiped her eyes, and she wasn't the only one. "Here's the pattern I found," Daniel went on, and his voice grew stronger. "People break promises. Every generation, every single time. Adam broke it in a perfect garden. A whole world broke it in Noah's day. The Israelites broke it with the ink still wet at the mountain. Kings broke it on their thrones. And if you're honest," he looked out at them, "you've broken it too. I have. That's not the exception in this story. That's the whole human race." He let that land. Then he leaned in. "But every single time we broke the promise, God did something no one would expect. He didn't destroy us. He reached back. And he reached back with something bigger than what we'd thrown away." An older man near the front nodded slowly, gripping the arm of his chair. "I used to think the message of the Bible was, 'Try harder,'" Daniel said. "Follow the rules. Be good enough. Earn your way back." He shook his head. "But that's not it at all. That's the thing the covenant with Moses proved once and for all. We had the perfect law carved in stone, and we still couldn't do it. Not because we didn't know better, because something was broken in here." He pressed his hand to his chest. "In the heart. And no rule ever written could reach it." He picked up the notebook then and held it up. "My grandfather spent his whole life chasing one question," he said. "Why does God keep making new promises to people who keep breaking them? What is he building toward?" Daniel's voice thickened. "He died before he wrote down the answer. But I found it. And I need you to hear it tonight." The room went completely still. "He was building toward a new kind of promise," Daniel said. "One that doesn't depend on us at all. The old covenants always had a part that rested on human shoulders, and human shoulders always failed. But the new one, the one Jesus named in that upstairs room over bread and wine, rests entirely on him. On forgiveness. On grace. And that's why it's the only one that can't break." He looked out at them. "You are not holding it up. You were never strong enough to hold it up. He is." Somewhere in the back, someone let out a quiet sob. "And here's the part that changed me," Daniel continued. "This isn't about earning acceptance through being perfect. If it were, none of us would make it. It's about transformation from the inside out. The one thing the law could never do. The new covenant reaches down into the exact place that's broken the heart, and it does what no set of rules ever could. It makes you new." He set the notebook down gently. "The same promise that started thousands of years ago in a garden is still open tonight," he said. In this room, to you. The invitation hasn't expired. Humanity can be restored, forgiven, given a new beginning. That's not ancient history. That's an offer that's still standing right now. Daniel paused and his eyes moved across the room from face to face. "Let me tell you what the whole Bible is from the first page to the last," he said quietly. "It's a story that begins with humanity separated from God. It follows generation after generation of people searching for hope, breaking promises, losing their way. It reaches its climax with one man in Jerusalem who tied every broken thread together. And it ends." His voice caught. "It ends with a promise of a future where suffering and fear and separation finally disappear. For good. Forever." He let the silence stretch. "Every covenant in the Bible," he said, "every promise, every sacrifice, every lamb on every altar, it was never really about rules. It was never about agreements or contracts or terms. It was about one thing, one unchanging message running underneath the entire story, like a thread you can't see until you step back far enough." He looked out at them and he said it plainly. "God has always been moving toward you. From the garden until now. He has never stopped coming, and the entire Bible is the record of that unstoppable promise." Later that night, after the room had emptied, an old man lingered by the door. He came up to Daniel slowly, and he was holding a worn Bible of his own, his hands trembling. "Son," he said, "I've read this book for 60 years, and I always felt like I was reading pieces." His eyes filled. "You just handed me the whole thing. In one night. You handed me the whole thing." Daniel felt his throat close. He thought of his grandfather on the floor of that archive, chasing a thread he'd die before he could finish. He thought of the notebook and the blue line, and the name circled at the end of it. "I didn't hand you anything," Daniel said gently. "It was always there. Someone just had to point at it." The old man nodded, and he squeezed Daniel's hand, and he walked out into the night, carrying his Bible, like it had come alive in his arms. And Daniel stood alone in the quiet room, the notebook back in his hands. He thought about the question he'd asked on that first day, kneeling in the dust, refusing to believe it could all be one story. If that were true, someone would have noticed. Someone had noticed. His grandfather had noticed. And now, because of a box he almost didn't open, Daniel had spent his life making sure others would too. He opened the notebook one last time to the very first page, to the word underlined twice in fading ink. Covenant. He ran his thumb over it. And he understood finally and completely what his grandfather had spent his whole life trying to say. The Bible was never a collection of broken pieces. It was one promise kept alive across thousands of years by a God who refused to give up on people who kept giving up on him. Humanity fell and he came. Humanity failed and he stayed. Humanity ran and he followed all the way from a garden to a mountain to a throne to a cross, straight to the doorstep of every heart still willing to open the box. The thread was always there, and it still runs unbroken all the way to you.